Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kirsten Wiley and I manage the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Today we welcome John Palfrey here to discuss with us the digital natives, the first generation of children and young adults to grow up in a wholly digital age. Their exposure to and facility with today's most advanced technologies has given them a radically different view of life on this planet and has also led to a variety of concerns from parents, such as are parents right to worry about internet addiction? And I'm going to add one of my own. Is it okay for your 5-year-old to want to set up a website called Ryan.com? John Palfrey is professor of law and vice dean at Harvard Law School and a faculty director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law School. He also chairs the Internet Safety Technical Task Force made up of leading internet service companies and nonprofit groups focused on children's safety. So please join me in welcoming John Palfrey to Microsoft Research. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the chance to come and talk about this book with such a brilliant group here at Microsoft. Many good friends and some new friends as well in the audience. And we're very grateful to have this forum, also to talk with people who aren't here in the room. And we've got high hopes for having a conversation together. One thing I wanted just to point out is a technology little game here that we're going to try playing, which is a live question tool. If anybody has a laptop in the room, please feel free to log into it. The URL is up here at cyber.law.harvard.edu/question/borndigitalms. And if you are remotely watching this, I hope that you might actually log into the question tool. And if you want to lob in a question synchronously, that would be great. And we'll try to figure out how to get that into the conversation as well. So the book that I wrote with my friend Urs Gasser, who is a professor in Switzerland, is called Born Digital. And the idea behind the book really was to counter a series of myths that we think have been pervading kind of the public discourse about kids and technology. Our idea was, after having heard so many stories about how these kids are bad or how these kids are in danger or how these kids are dumber, that we wanted to figure out who's done great research out there, much in the way that I'm sure MSR does at the beginning of a project and scans what other brilliant minds have come up with, and then to do our own research and then to figure out which of these myths ought to be busted, which of these myths should we take down, and which ones are actually serious. What are the things that we, as parents, as teachers, as technologists, ought to worry about as our kids are growing up in totally digitally mediated ways? So that was basically the premise, was to say, let's talk about what is emerging as a culture war with our kids as pawns in this discussion about whether they're in fact a worse generation somehow or somehow better. So by mode, what I want to do is talk about some of those myths and what some of our research showed. I'd love to be interrupted at any point in the room with hands waved or on the question tool. Be delighted to be interrupted as I go along. Then I want to show you a few provocations, things that young people, in fact, made as part of this process, and then open it up relatively quickly for questions and have just a conversation about it. We thought about this book less as a research book for academics, but more as a book for parents and teachers, and really to be a conversation starter. So I hope we will do that all here today. Okay, so for starters, here's some of the myths that we took up and some of the myths that we sought to bust. The first one is really the simple one of saying, very often I think people talk about kids as all the same in this respect, that if you were born at a certain moment in history, that you use technology in a very similar way. Obviously, this is, for many in the room, a simple statement, but there are only 1 billion people on the network to begin with, right? So out of the 6 billion people in the world, there are lots of people who don't have access to the technology. Kentaro and others who work in India have seen this and worked on this digital divide problem, the literal divide. But I think there's another aspect to this, which is, as we talk to young people, we found that there's a fairly large gap in terms of skills between those who are born with the right moment in history as their birth date and who have access to the tool, so you might have it in a library or in your school, but who don't actually have the same skills as other kids. We saw a very wide range of the abilities and sophistication to deal with how to learn and how to be safe in this environment. So I think the first sort of key myth is not everybody born after 1980 on the planet is a digital native. There's nothing kind of native to it. It's a population, not a generation. And it's a group of people who have a position of privilege, and that we ought to worry actually about those who are on the other side of this participation gap, as Henry Jenkins and Esther Hargitay and other good scholars call it. So that's kind of myth number one, is that we're talking about a population, not strictly speaking a generation. Obvious, I think, to many of you here. A second myth is that these kids are bad, that somehow, by virtue of having been born at this moment in history, that declension is happening, right? That this generation is worse. I think there's always this sense from an older generation about a younger generation, oh my God, they have access now to television, they must be horrible people. If you scroll back in American history, you know, of course, the first generations were worried about religious declension, right? They weren't as religious in 1760 as they were in 1660 and so forth. So we've got this history of always worrying about this badness. There's also the sense that every time a new technology comes into the world, that there's a moral panic around it. And I think it's fairly clear from the research we and others have done that these kids aren't bad in any meaningful sense. It is true that sometimes when our conversations are mediated by digital technologies, so that it's sending an email, and before you know it, you hit send and you cringe and say, oh my God, did I really send that? So we all have had that regret that sometimes we're meaner through these technologies than otherwise. But I don't think this is something that we can extrapolate out. And we should talk about the topic of bullying. We'll return to this in another context. But I think on the badness front, many people have jumped on this idea that cyberbullying is this new terrible phenomenon, and it's quite right that most of the research shows that more young people are getting into bullying situations when they are online. But I think one of the things that we found in talking to kids about it is that the bullying is not any different, particularly than the schoolyard bullying, right? It's simply that it's exposed in this environment, that all of a sudden it's something that parents and teachers can see happening in front of them, and it's recorded. So later on you can come back and see it. And the dynamics, though, are very similar to the schoolyard environment. It's just that's where some of the social things are happening. So I think myth number two is I don't think there is data to suggest that these kids are bad or meaner in ways that another generation are. They're just facing different contexts and different challenges. Myth number three, that these kids are somehow more in danger than they were before. Chuck Cosson and Jules and I are participating in something that is called the Internet Safety Technical Task Force. And this is 49 state attorney generals, absent Texas, have entered into a joint statement, query as to where Texas is on this, but entered into a joint statement with MySpace initially and then Facebook subsequently. And the output of that is a group of us who are working over the course of this year to figure out whether technologies have a place in terms of keeping kids safer online. And one of the things we've been doing in this is reviewing all the literature and all the research around whether kids are more in danger today than they were before. And it's quite right that there are terrible things that happen to some kids when they go online. They get lured into offline encounters and people do bad things to them. Absolutely there's data to show that that happens. Absolutely there is data to show a growing number of young people who are getting bullied in online environments. But what I don't think is there in the data is that kids are any less safe today overall than they were a decade ago. So that it is the case that kids are not safe, that there is risk in kids' lives, and that it's happening in different environments. But it's not the case that this is wildly different than it was a decade ago, and that many of the tools and common sense that parents and teachers bring to it might in fact work just as well today as they were before. Myth number 4 that I want to do, let's see, Lily is laughing, so I'm going to pause. Did you see something that we should take up here? Yes, that's true. That's true. Okay, so Roman. Is Roman in the room, just out of curiosity, or Roman is remote? Or Roman is not saying who they are. This is authentication. Anyway, hi, Roman, if you're out there. Says, have you had a conversation, debate with Mark Bauerlein, the dumbest generation? If so, how did it turn out? If not, what things would you want to ask/tell him? I look forward to having this conversation. I haven't. I did download on my Kindle The Dumbest Generation and have read it. I disagree with it. I suspect that's obvious. I'm about to talk about how I think this generation is not dumber than any other generation. I think it's an interesting conversation to have. And there is some data in that book that I think is worth taking up. One of the things that I think is worth wondering about is there's a fair amount of data that suggests that young people are less likely to read a book cover to cover, right? That the people today are somehow less likely to engage in the kind of sustained argument that takes this form, right? And, as someone who has written a few of these, that's sort of troubling, I guess. But I think a few things are wrong with that argument. First of all, I think it is facile to say it's a dumber generation. I don't think there's any way that the data add up to dumber kids today than they were before. But that was sort of going into the data and saying, I just don't think it says that. But the second thing that I think it misses is really some of the insight that Lily and others here have, which is that kids are learning in just different ways in some cases. And it's not that sometimes that's or that that's always better, but it's different, right? That kids actually are getting information in different formats. One thing that our research showed very plainly was if you asked a bunch of kids, how did you look up some topic that you were interested in? So we use the Spanish-American War as one example. If you were given a high school report to go look up the Spanish-American War, what would you do? I suspect it's obvious to everybody in this room that 100% of the kids we talked to, whether they were here in the U.S., if they were in Switzerland, they were in the Gulf, they were in Shanghai, they went on one of these things, right? They opened up IE or Firefox or Opera or whatever else they had. They would go to their favorite search engine, Google or MSN or whatever. They would type in Spanish-American War. They would look at the series of 10 things that came up. They would find the Wikipedia entry for Spanish-American War. They would click on it. And then you finally got to some variation. And I think this is where I would engage the dumbest generation conversation, which is I think that what is interesting to watch is this is where the participation gap plays out for me. It's that some kids are very sophisticated about what they find at Wikipedia. You get to the Wikipedia page for the Spanish-American War, and in fact, at that point, you say, you know what? My classmate could have been here a few minutes before, could have made some edits just to mess me up, and I'm not going to, take this as the gospel, right? This is possibly something that's not actually true. I'm going to go find some other sources. I'm going to scroll to the bottom of the page, find the other links that are there, triangulate, come back to it, maybe actually read some books or something else about it, and kind of put this together. And the most sophisticated kids absolutely tell you that story. The less sophisticated kids, though, are the ones who really do just cut and paste it, right? They say, okay, I went to Wikipedia, there it is, that's the encyclopedia entry, you kind of translate that directly. And I think this is where the challenge comes back to parents and teachers, is to say, are we giving kids the skills to figure out how to learn when this is one of the first sources you get to, right? And are we giving them the skills to discern from credible from non-credible links at the bottom of the page? And are we giving them the skills that say, actually, you know what, you should walk into a library, right? You ought to go browse on some shelves, or even digital shelves that might have, different books here, because you might learn something, and it might, in fact, introduce serendipity into it. And I'm not sure we've gotten to the point where we're teaching kids to do this. And I love the notion, one thing Lily was showing us earlier, is having a game on the Xbox. Am I giving away something non-public here? But having a game for the Xbox which enables kids to create something, right? To create their own kind of a game. And she's described the way that kids can make the game to blow up things, and that's kind of exciting, and then you can pass the game to other people. I really just think that there are different ways in which young people are getting this information, processing it, remaking it, and in the most sophisticated cases, that they actually may be learning much better by virtue of this process than before. But it's that they're learning differently. And I think we as schools and technologists and parents and so forth, we need to engage that. So those are 4 myths. I want to pause and make sure I'm not missing anything else critical at this point. Great. We'll come back to some of those, which I think are of interest. Kim, were you going to raise something? No. Okay, so I wanted to take up in a way the question that Lily had on there, which is the process actually of writing this book and thinking about what it says about what a book is at this moment. You're a fancy bookseller here, and of course, we will continue to have books that take this format. But one of the things that struck us, especially after doing the research and doing it in a collaborative way with lots of students involved in the research itself, was that the fact of having it in this kind of analog form, the thing that's on the shelf and is sold at the back of the room, is sort of an artifact, right? It's a wonderful artifact. It's a great technology. It's great that it takes this form. And I now run a big library, and we have 1.7 million volumes, and still we count in terms of the volumes that we have, and we still spend millions of dollars to buy the volumes. But if you think about it, the book itself is really no more than a series of bits, right? It's a series of bits that we've collected over time. So it starts with an idea that there are these myths. We'd like to bust some of them and bring some sort of conversation to the topic. So we go out there and we read what everybody else has read, right? And we do a literature review and we take some notes about that. We've been using Basecamp as our sharing, but it could be SharePoint or whatever else, Moss, I guess now it's called. We use different tools to share it. And then, we sit down and we have a conversation about what do we want to say about it, right? And then we kind of wrestle it into another format, and you write the book, and it's 388 pages on a Microsoft Word document, right? And we put that up into the cloud as well, and that's shared up there on Basecamp. And then we find somebody who's willing to put it into this format for us, right? And then send it to Kim Ricketts and send it, all around to different to bookstores. But the fact of that printing is sort of an artifact of the past in a sense. And we also recognize that some kids are actually going to come at this topic very differently. We recognize that some of the kids we talk to in our research are not going to read it in a book form, and we actually wanted kids to interact with these topics and to help us. The other thing that we recognized at that moment was at the point at which we hit the publish button, right, and it turns into this book, it's frozen in a difficult way and it's obsolete. So I recognize, though it came out last week, it is an obsolete book. So we wanted to address this by saying, let's make the book actually be a series of digital things. It's born in a digital format, and we put it into some different formats over here. So we like wikis at the Berkman Center where I work. I know that Lily and others like wikis around here. You have a cool intranet wiki project going. So we actually started, before writing the book in the regular Microsoft Word format, we started doing it in MediaWiki. And as we did our research and asked our questions and so forth, we put the entire book, roughly speaking, by chapter up here. So on each topic, we created a page, and as we were writing different things up and reading different resources, we put it in this format so that anybody could log in, create an account, and edit our book, in essence, as we were writing it. It's not exactly the book in the format of 388 pages for copyright and other reasons, which we could get into, but we put it up here with the notion that it would live in some fashion. It would live as a place that people, particularly young people, could have a conversation about it. One fun thing that happened last week with the wiki, which I think also gets to this nature of the book question, is we got an email across the transom from a guy who writes for O'Reilly. His name is Andy Oram, and he had some slightly cranky things to say about our book, which was fine. He said, I'm writing a review, and I'm going to put it on O'Reilly. I was sort of prepared for this, which is the book is written for parents and teachers, and if you read it as a technologist, you might have the reaction that said, nothing is really new here. So that was sort of his review, was you're not saying anything new for a technologist, and that's fine. And he said, but what I'm going to do is see if you're going to eat your own dog food. I'm going to put the review, before I publish it in O'Reilly, up on your wiki, and people can have at it. You can edit it and kind of play with it and so forth. And sure enough, it's a little hard to see from here, but you can log into digitalnative.org and see it. Andy put his review in the making up here, and lots of people, myself, young people, other researchers and so forth, put comments as it went along, and I don't think anybody actually edited his wiki entry. This was a curious thing. I was saying most people just sort of commented after it in italics. But sure enough, a week later, he published the same thing to the O'Reilly site. It was edited by virtue of this collaborative process with young people and others, and came out in a slightly different form than if he had press publish on that Monday. So I think there's a fair amount in this format and this mode that might portend good things for the future of books, that we absolutely need to press publish in this format. It's a wonderful technology. I like my Kindle, but its battery tends to die on long plane flights, and it's always a bummer when I actually wish I had some of these hard copies there. But I also think that the process of putting it in a format like this may be an interesting thing for having the ideas be, the focus of what a book is, rather than having it be format specific. I don't know, Lily, could I pause there for a second? Would you talk about the wiki that you guys have going and how that kind of fits into the same story?
Well, I guess,
Or do we have a mic, actually?
Sure. So we're doing a wiki at Microsoft.
Can we see it on the screen? Or no?
Yeah.
Let's see, can I steal your thing?
It's down here.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, introduce myself? I'm Lily Chang, and I run a research group called Creative Systems, and the things that we work on here in the team relate a lot to design and social computing. And so one of the things we've been doing is we're creating this wiki. Usually it's wider, and so the pictures have some like weird issues, but you can kind of see like what people have posted, and we just sort of describe the wiki and what the purpose is, and then you can also see new changes that people have and contributions that different people have made. And really the goal is to kind of collect everything about Microsoft that's public and have people in the company sort of edit it and author it. And so I guess kind of like you were saying, it's a living place, and the way that people discover and find information is often sort of biased by where you sit. So the more open you make the information, and the more it can kind of be a discussion, the more you can figure out what's going on. So like, you guys should all just go there, Micropedia, click on your page, write something about yourself or your project or your group, and then just see who else comments on it, or go to a project that you're interested in. So you should just check it out.
I'm imagining some wild typing in the audience here, people editing their entries. So Lily, we were walking over here and you said you're a wiki lover. Why are you a wiki lover? And would you mind giving us some critique on our Digital Natives Wiki, how we might make it a better conversation with young people?
Yeah, I have become a wiki lover. I don't know what's happened to me. I think what I love about it is it's really easy. First of all, the way you author information, I think, is different when you author it to be shared. So you compare that to an email. A lot of times I'll write an email, which is really useful for everybody, but I don't really author it in that way that it can be understood by everybody. So I think you author things in a way that they can be understood by everyone, and then you also author it so that it can be broken up into lots of little pieces. So what I love about your wiki, is you kind of just break it down all the time.
We're live over here, sorry.
Oh. Yeah, so like just the table of contents at the top level, and then the ability to kind of drill in to the different chapters. So, it's not linear in the way that a book is. I can decide what I'm interested in and just sort of drill in and see and search it. And all this information can be decomposed, and you can search for it and find it from anywhere. So a lot of people might come to these topics not because they know anything about the book, but they might just be searching on digital safety, and they might come to a page and find it that way. Just like with Wikipedia, most people don't go to the homepage of Wikipedia to find things. They're coming in through to Wikipedia from all different places. So I just love the scenario of the book review, right? I mean, typically those would be completely disaggregated, and you would never be able to actually, I just wanted to go read it. I wanted to read, well, what did he say initially? How did they comment on it? What was that dialogue? And then what was the review? I'd love to see that for any review of anything, right? Because so often you're just presented with the facts at the end, but you don't know, for those who care, why. And it's great to see all the additional research and, the additional opinions and thought that went into kind of the final output. So I think just like most products or anything that you make, sometimes the process is more interesting, or the process that happens after it gets published. So what's the discussion afterwards, and what change happened because of the book, I think is really interesting to see.
Cool. Any other thoughts on this wiki business and sort of the future of the book? Anybody willing to pipe up? Not on that one. I'm just going to check the question tool to make sure we're not missing something good from the asynchronous side. See if it comes up. No, it's not displaying. We'll try in a moment. So I wanted to push ahead a little bit in the story and say, as we were thinking also about this digital native crew, the people who we saw learning in this slightly different way, we wanted also to give them a chance to tell the story, not just in the wiki, but to try to translate it. So I think we all have this intuition that young people may not be as likely to take the book off the shelf and read it cover to cover. Maybe they're more likely to read a chapter at a time or something, and maybe there's good in that and bad. But we also wanted to give them a chance to put it in the 3 to 5 minute video format, right? The sense that some of their colleagues might well be more likely to watch something on YouTube than to read this. And we wanted the same research to come through in a format that might actually get them talking about it. So we hired a bunch of interns this summer. And we gave them a little lunch money and the chance to hang out in the Berkman Center. And we basically threw the book at them and said, look, we've written this book, read it, and figure out what interests you. What in this book is something that you think is, worth interpreting and retelling, and make a video. And make a video that tells the story of one of the chapters. So I want to show a video in a moment, which is I had nothing to do with, other than throwing the book at this person and giving them some computing equipment. This was their version of our chapter on digital dossiers. And the young woman involved was named Kanu Tiwari. She's a high school student from Egypt. She's family's from India. She's a wonderfully smart, creative young person, as you'll see in a moment. But she had no particular technology skills before this happened. This was not somebody who had been going to a technical school and was a computer programmer. This was somebody who was a regular smart kid from another culture who comes to the United States, is given a series of tools and an idea and a job to interpret it. And I want to just play you, if we can beg forgiveness for 3 or 4 minutes of video, what Kanu Tiwari says about digital dossiers.
Just about all of us have a digital dossier, but many of us have no idea what it even is. Your dossier is the accumulation of all the digital tracks you leave behind. And this accumulation did not just start last week, month, or even year. It started before you were even born. The line between your digital dossier and your identity is constantly shifting. One way to see the implication of this movement is to imagine how information goes into the file of a child born today. Let's call him Andy. The first entry into Andy's file occurs while he's still 5 months into the womb. It is a sonogram, probably framed by his parents, or even forwarded via email to their closest relatives. The same picture will also be copied in Andy's hospital folder and into a file for the pediatrician who will take over after his birth. As the new baby grows, so do the number of items in his digital file. Andy's barcoded bracelet lists facts like gender, time of birth, surname, and more. Friends and family will come to meet the baby, bring gifts, and take more photos, probably with phones or digital cameras. These photos are then also uploaded to other Flickr feeds or Facebook albums as part of the welcoming process. Andy's parents will use their phones to spread the news with SMS text messages, saying something along the lines of "healthy baby boy, born 6 pounds at 5:30 p.m. Friends will also post to the Flickr feeds, which will conveniently contain multitudes of Andy's pictures. This process of capturing and spreading pictures will continue for Andy's entire life, with pictures of the first time Andy sits, stands, walks, and talks. As Andy grows, he will now be able to independently share information about himself. He registers as a user on Neopets, where he fills out his name, age, birth date, and other details. Half of the blanks may not be even necessary to fill out, but Andy does not notice the significance of the asterisks as described at the bottom of the page. And so, Andy grows bigger, taller, and broader, and with him grows his digital dossier. As an adolescent, he is sucked into Facebook, where he posts pictures, videos, and information about his likes and dislikes. Facebook in turn deposits cookies into his web browser, tracking his activities. He signs up for a Gmail account and regularly uses Google to research for information needed in school assignments. Google in turn keeps tabs on all the searches Andy makes from his IP address. In college, he buys books from Amazon, which asks for his mailing address and credit card number. Andy's credit card company adds even more details to his dossier: the date, time, location, and price of every purchase he makes. And as Andy moves around, the GPS in his cell phone enables his service provider to know where he is and how many times he has been there recently. He is also filmed by surveillance cameras whenever he walks into secured college buildings. When Andy gets married, his dossier expands to encompass all the information about his wife, and they start a weblog together to share their thoughts and opinions online. Together they compile shelf upon shelf of digital tracks, files that are recorded and stored under their names. And when Andy has his first baby, aptly named Andy Jr., the cycle is started all over again. These data points, some publicly accessible, others safeguarded to various degrees by companies and agencies that collect and store this data, make Andy's identity as it forms, even before he himself begins to shape it. And Andy's digital dossier will even grow after his death. Photos or videos of the funeral, RIP messages on MSN Messenger, or his Facebook status posts. Andy probably never knew how large his dossier was. How aware are you of the tracks you leave behind? Want to learn more about your digital dossier?
So this video made me incredibly happy, I have to say. Not because of the topic, which is serious, and which lots of people here at Microsoft are working hard on, but the notion, just sort of the educational notion, that with extraordinarily widely available technologies and no particular skill, smarts, but no particular skill, a kid could take this set of concepts, do her own research. She pulled lots of examples that I hadn't put into the book, and create something as evocative of as that, with basically a few months of time, right, or maybe a month of time. There's something in that, I think, that is the core story here, or the core story that I took away from writing this book, was that in these kids is not a dumbest generation, but rather is a set of skills and ability to tell the narrative of their times, the ability really to take the story of their generation and to tell it in these really interesting ways. We just have to figure out, how do you engage that? How do you make it so that that creativity is the leading story, not the fact that they're only paying attention to 140 character Twitter posts or whatever that I think are what others may focus on. I wanted also then to show just one other of these videos, in part because it's kind of fun to watch videos, but because I think it's also demonstrates a second of the big issues that we came up on, which is going to be obvious. This is the second part of a three-part video. I'm not going to play all three, but I think its importance will be obvious.
The hardest part, I realized immediately, was the sense of isolation, which is that you felt kind of cut off from your peers, or at least I did. It felt to me as though everyone was doing it, and somehow I was caught. There was like a persistence of a stigma in a way too, which is that, like, do I want people to know this about me? Isn't it kind of embarrassing? It felt somehow embarrassing to be caught, to be named in the newspaper, to be kind of the victim of this. Half the people that I would talk to about it would ask me, what should I do? And on one hand, I wanted to tell them, hey, be safe. Like, you probably don't want to do it. But on the other hand, I had a very different reaction. I didn't want to help an organization that had hurt me. I was supposed to kind of like infect the mentality that file sharing is okay with this antivirus of, no, it's not okay, it's dangerous. And I kind of ultimately decided to try to go somewhere between those two paths. I eventually started telling almost everybody I knew. People would say something to me like, how you doing, man? How's life? And I'm like, pretty bad. I got sued by the RIAA, and their reaction would usually just be like, whoa, dude. Before I was sued by the RIAA, I never interrogated what I was doing, really. It was an activity that was largely unreflected upon. And when this was going down, I remember thinking, wow, I did something wrong. And I still believe that I did something wrong. Like, I didn't have a right to take that music. What's just dangerous here is that there's a voice of establishment speaking down on you, which is reigning a morality of, this is right and this is wrong. You don't own this, you can't take it, you can't make with it. And when you read these articles in Wired magazine, New York Times, major news sources about the music industry losing money, I'm shocked that they can't see the obviousness of, we alienated the most lucrative consumer pool, being teens and young adults. And when you alienate your primary consumer pool, it's hard to both get them to buy the Britney Spears album while you're busting them for downloading the Britney Spears album, and I think that these things need to be rectified.
So I wanted to show this one less because it made me happy in the way that Kanu's one did, although I think it's equally creative and interesting, of a young person sort of telling the story of, again, something that lots of their peers have no doubt experienced, but really to make a slightly different point, which is I started by talking about some myths that we were busting. There are some myths that were out there that happen to be true, right? So just to put it as plainly as possible, of the kids that we talked to in interviews and focus groups, basically 100% said that they got their music the same way. The vast, vast, vast majority of kids said they got it when they were given the cloak of anonymity through LimeWire or Kazaa or something, pretty much illegally, and they pretty much knew it was illegal in the way that Zach did. So there really was the fairly pervasive activity of doing it in this way that one expected. The only variation to this, and it won't be of any surprise at all to those of you here, was a few kids in every group who got it legally, but they got it through iTunes, right? They didn't get it at Tower Records. They've liquidated their stores, or they got it through their Zune. And in every case, those kids had been given some money, right? They'd been given some money on a gift card that was then loaded up, and they were doing the exact same act, right? They were just downloading music, whether it was from the music store that you guys offer, or a music store that some other paying service offers, or from LimeWire or Kazaa. And this made us reflect on, if you put kids into the position of having the conversation about it, will they think about it any differently, right? And what I think we saw with Zach McCune here was a recognition that it was actually wrong. And yes, he had to pay a fine, but he got involved very much in the conversation about file sharing through the making of this video. And this actually comes around to a project that we're working on with some of you here through your LCA group. We've been working with Tom Rubin and Jeffrey Manny and others on how could we, in fact, put kids in the position of being a creator and have them think a little bit more thoughtfully about piracy, but also have them think more thoughtfully about the creative act of actually being the people who are making something and then having those rights. So we're making a curriculum, an online curriculum in the form of some games, which put kids in the position of creating some digital work, much like these videos, and having them think about the rights that come in from other sources, whether they're licensed officially or Creative Commons or otherwise, and then licensing those rights outbound. It seems like this is another example where the kinds of things you're playing with here at Microsoft Research as getting kids involved in the making of the content, in fact, could help them think about the fact that there are artists or there are creators on the other side who need to make a livelihood. And I've been amazed by the extent to which, when you do put kids in this posture, they start talking about it very, very differently. It's no longer the recording industry is the man or this big company is the man, but it's rather, oh yeah, I can see how, as a creator, I would have these balancing interests. Maybe I want to become famous, so I want to give it away, or maybe I want to become rich, I want to sell it in some fashion. So that was sort of the outcome that we had from the piracy conversation. Can I pause there? Yes, sir.
The difference between the scenarios, though, if you give a kid a card for iTunes,
yeah,
they're effectively buying a song for $1.
Yeah.
But if they are having to buy a CD for one song they want, they're buying a song for $10 or $15. And what I've seen from kids that are illegally downloading stuff, their reaction is more against, I want one song, not 14 crappy ones and one good one.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the pressure that they're undergoing. And that once they get away from, iTunes opened up the opportunity, and Zune too.
Right, Zune has come right in. Exactly.
To allow you to buy the thing you want. And I found that the pressure from the kids that I've talked to is considerably less about stealing if they get just what they want for the price that they want.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it is about availability, it's about format, it's about access, it's what can you, and then what can you do with it ultimately, right? So I think it's a really good example why they don't buy CDs, but it's also why the tethered downloads that we know were the initial attempt by the recording industry didn't work, right? It was, or the formatting, you have to buy $15 worth or $19 worth. Absolutely, it's there is something of a distinction there. Sir?
One time I signed wrought. I joined a music service and then I turned it off after a while because I wasn't using it. And they asked me the question, why are you leaving us? And two of the choices were, there were a bunch of choices, but two of them were, you have more time than money, you have more money than time, or something like that. And I thought it was a great question. I checked I have more money than time. I don't have enough time to use the service. And in all the examples you've shown of kids and the kids you've talked to, it seems to me that the one common thread among all of them is they have more time than money. And in fact, even the ones who legitimately get music get it from someone else paying for it in the same way that, so it's
and it was always like the preppy lacrosse playing girl, and whose dad had given her the money, and then all the other kids look at them in the focus group and like, you're just the rich kid, forget it. It was sort of exactly.
But even in terms of the one who created the thing about Digital Dossier, it took some months to do that. Months that people who are older almost necessarily won't have. Even those who participate on a wiki probably have more time than others who don't. And there seems to be that. If there's a gap, it's in the gap of the amount of time available to devote to these things, particularly a conversation type thing, which takes more time than other people have. Did you look at that in any of the studies in terms of the kids and how they act and how that abundance of time that they might have that older generations simply don't have affects their perception of these things and the amount that they participate in?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts, but Lily, you were raising your hand, so let me put you on the spot.
Probably because I'm I think it's interesting that we do a lot of email, and that's a lot of time authoring. And I think sometimes there's a bias to think that, well, writing your wiki page entry is less. Maybe it's just about learning a new tool and changing habits. But I do think kids, in some sense, from what I see, are just more comfortable in different media, and the ability to reuse content is much higher in most of the social media. So, for example, if you think of, I can change my status in Facebook, and now all 400 people or whatever see it. It's one message that goes out to a lot of people. But I wouldn't ever email 400 people my status, because it would just be weird and interruptive. So I do think we should think about how much time we spend in different tools, and probably really look at the time usage. It'd be just interesting to see who spends more time. We might be just using different tools sometimes than what the kids are using today.
It's a really interesting orientation and question, which is, if you have more time, do you do more creative stuff, right? What do you do with the time that you have? And we didn't do any A/B comparison, and our data set's too small and so forth to say, if you had more time, would you spend it doing this and so forth. But one thing that seemed clear to me is we have these kids in school many hours a day for, a couple hundred days a year, right? There's a lot of time when they're actually doing some form of learning, and they're doing lots of learning outside the school environment too, right? They're getting news and information all the time, and many of them are, doing creative, kind of recreating things. And I think it came back to me in the sense of, are we using that time well? Are we in fact teaching kids the skills to sort between different bits of information, some more credible than others? Are we giving kids the skills to realize you don't just have to receive the information, you actually can create it yourself or recreate it and be part of the conversation in that way? So I'm not positive that it's because they have more time or have less time. I was just thinking, are we using well the time that we do have and the time that we are doing these things? In the category of myths that I was hoping to bust or otherwise, I should admit one thing on this score, which was I came at this research hoping to find lots and lots of kids who are doing wildly creative, incredible things, right? And that I'd just be able to write a celebratory book. Civic activism is just alive and well on the web, and creativity is this great wedge into an active bunch of citizens, and semiotic democracy is going to transform the world. And we sort of sought out some of these kids, and you know what? There aren't that many kids doing incredibly creative things, right? You have to structure the environment. You have to give them the space to do it. You have to give them the encouragement. And there's nothing new there, right? That's parenting. That's teaching. That's being a librarian. That's being, a mentor, is giving kids the space and the encouragement to do it. The other aspect of this sort of myth in the making, and this is really a sense that a lot of us Web 2.0 enthusiasts have been putting out the kind of kids have gone from consumers to creators, right? So we're busting our own myth in a sense. When I asked that question about the Spanish-American War and how you got the information, after looking at the Wikipedia page and figuring out what they did to find the information, I then said, so how many of you have ever edited a Wikipedia page? So how many people in this room have edited a Wikipedia page? So this is a pretty good crowd. I don't know, maybe a quarter of the people in the room, and Microsoft Research Building 99 have actually edited. So within our sample of 100 kids or whatever in these in-depth interviews, maybe 2 or 3 had done any editing of a Wikipedia page. And then the follow-up question was, how many people had made a substantive edit? Like you'd added a fact or you added something. How many people have made a substantive edit to a Wikipedia page? So actually substantially fewer people. So maybe a fifth of those who said they did made substantial edits. None of the kids we talked to, not one, nobody had ever made a substantive edit to a Wikipedia page. And when you asked, what did you do? They changed a period to a comma or something. They were the OCD kids who didn't want to see a mistake or something on this page, right? So it wasn't that there's this huge groundswell of all of us, kind of using these wonderful social technologies. As much as we wanted to see that and celebrate it, it wasn't there. And so one of the things we've ended up saying in this book is, in the context of civic activism, in the context of innovation or creativity, yes, the affordances are there that the technology gives us to do it. Yes, there are shining examples of brilliant kids who are doing it, but it's not a groundswell, right? We just don't have the data to do that. To me, as the glass half full person, or even the glass tiny bit full person, I'm thinking, that's a seed of change, right? That's something that we can encourage as teachers and parents and so forth to make the case for why all this is really important. Did you have a hand up in the back?
I just wanted to mention that sometimes the rules are different depending upon how you're, with whatever you're engaging in.
Yeah.
I had a friend who was living in Istanbul, and she was using LimeWire, and she said it was illegal. And when she moved to the States, she knew it was not legal. She didn't use it at all, and I think removed it, and went to Syracuse University, and didn't know that actually they were the files in their machine were accessed by other people, and then she was sued as well. So, and she actually had no knowledge of participating in something illegal.
So this is borne out very much in our research. I glossed over this fact when I was talking about piracy, but there's a huge range of how confused these kids are about legality, and it's not that surprising. Copyright is a complex topic, right? Not very many of us went to law school. Even those who did, we have trouble figuring out intellectual property. Even those of us who are paid to teach it have problems working out the doctrine, right? This is a very complex thing, and the most important doctrine in some ways for this story is the fair use doctrine, right? This is to say, if something is per se illegal, what in fact is one of the excuses? Well, fair use is a 4-factor balancing test, right? It's the right to hire a lawyer. It's not exactly something totally intuitive for all kids. And if you think about copyright, it's one of these things that was of no import or didn't attach for any kids 200 years ago, right? It was only relevant to people who wrote maps, charts, and books, right? Whatever the things that were covered by copyright. That's just totally not true. 200 years later, if you're interacting with these digital media every single day, creating it, recreating it, ripping it off, whatever you're doing, every day copyright matters to you. And there's wild confusion, among kids. So that's why we're thinking about it as a curricular matter. Is there a way that through a game or through something engaging, something creative, we can slip in some of the doctrine to say, it actually is illegal to do that, but here's what's not illegal. Here's what you can do under the law. These are the, the rights or the defenses, however you see it, that you do have. And in fact, we encourage you to take them up and act on them. Sir?
This is I don't know if you're in a question period.
Absolutely. The whole thing is a question period, I think.
Slightly different issue, but in the book you talk about, in passing, about expertise in multitasking and problems faced by having a lot of decisions, a lot of choices. I was just wondering if you saw any research on whether being exposed to a lot of multitasking or decision making with many options, whether people get better at it, whether kids get better at it or adults get better at it, whether there's, because that seems like a critical issue.
It's a great question. So our data set is very small. It's subject to lots of critiques like convenience sampling and so forth, and so we have nothing over time. So I can't answer it based on our own research. There are lots of great sort of educational theorists and so forth. Seymour Papert, of course, many years ago, through a whole crowd of people who are doing research in this area right now that I would point you to. If you're interested in digging in more to this, the MacArthur Foundation did a series of 6 books, the Digital Media and Learning series. Our colleague Dana Boyd is one of the authors and others. And there's tons of great data that have been done on different subtopics here that would, sort of maybe get you an answer to that question that I don't have. I would say just a couple of things about multitasking, which certainly came up substantially. I think multitasking is one of those attributes of digital natives that we talk to, and sometimes it's constructive and sometimes it's really lousy. So it's pretty clear. If you are teaching a class now at the Harvard Law School, I would not have so many people looking at me it's just not that. Everybody is like Seth. They're looking down into their laptop. And it's a very weird thing to give a lecture or to have what is a semi-Socratic dialogue with everybody looking into their laptop. And in many cases, they have multiple screens going, right? And every once in a while, you'll be talking about something serious, like the future of democracy, and some people start laughing, right? And, either some IMs were going back and forth, they're making fun of my tie, or, somebody sent out an interesting Twitter feed or updated their Facebook status or whatever. So, I think that there are instances in which young people are using the technology to multitask during class, which are definitely not good. Right? There's no extent to which, when I am talking about a complicated legal doctrine, that it's a good idea that they should be IMing with one another to make fun of my tie, right? Forget about me for a moment. That's just plainly not sort of paying attention the way that you are. On the other hand, if you're in a classroom where you're able to use the technology in a way that people are looking stuff up, people are triangulating, people are bringing new facts into the class, people are maybe expressing something in a different environment, or maybe trying to use the question tool, I think there are ways that we can make multitasking work for us. Just as a humorous aside on multitasking, one of the interviews I was doing in South Korea, talking to a bunch of young boys, they were describing multitasking, and they were showing me windows. They had many IM windows going at once, and the game they had was how many IM windows could they have with different girls without messing it up, so that one girl knew that they were talking to other girls, and it was like 8 or 9. It was really quite extraordinary how many they were coming up with. Please.
In how kids today, I don't have any idea, how they are parsing their information. For example, I grew up in the old days, but I remember one of the things I remember so clearly was my professor, when you'd ask him a question and he would look up like this. You'd watch him thinking. And that's one thing. And another thing was all the research I had to do to get information. Now I would just go to a computer and go find it, maybe. But I gained so much knowledge and so much experience just by going through that research, and most of what I discovered and the jewels of my education were from that process. And the thing that just concerns me is that kids aren't getting that, or they're not experiencing that, or maybe some kids are, just because that's their nature. But on the whole, it seems like everything is so fast and rapid. It's like, respond immediately, contribute immediately. There's not this kind of think, process, thinking process that's encouraged that I see.
This is another one of those great, impossible to answer in a short way kind of questions, and and I think this is a really good example where interdisciplinary research is so crucial, right? So it's something you guys do here. It's something we try to do at the Berkman Center, which is to say this is a problem that faces all of us, whether we're a law teacher or you're a researcher here or you're in business. Is how do kids come across information, then how do they process that particular information, how do they get more information, how do they then form judgments and so forth, and how does the speed, this faster rate of interaction affect that? So I think you'd have to be part neuroscientist, part psychologist, part educational theorist, whatever, to kind of put it together. And we should figure out how can we work together to answer a question like that. I'll give you just a couple of short observations, though, from the research that we did, which again is just sort of qualitative, and it really was trying to dig deeply on a few things, but without huge kind of force of large sampling sizes. One was I was struck by the need for contemplative spaces. The extent to which one of the threshold questions we asked kids was, do you have on you at this moment a digital device of some sort, right? Something that attaches to some network. And basically 100% of kids had some form of a cell phone or a PC or a BlackBerry or a Sidekick or whatever on them. Very few BlackBerries among our sample, but my own Crackberry problem, it's evident right here. So there is some extent to which it's an always-on sort of connectedness. Lots of kids. I wake up first thing, I open my PC, I see who friended me overnight, who commented on my blog, that kind of thing. And you do wonder, are there enough contemplative spaces out there? We work at a research center that studies this technology at Harvard, and it's a great, fun, vibrant place. I totally love it. You walk down a hallway, and it's like 50 people hitting you at all different, angles, and it's totally crowded and vibrant, and people coming up with the good ideas. We had a visitor a few years ago who's a professor from Switzerland, a very eminent senior professor, and I was having lunch with him at the end of the several months he spent with us, and in the elegant way that Europeans do, we were having a glass of wine at lunch at a nice restaurant and so forth. And I said to him, Professor Dre, what was your reaction? Did you like it? Did you have fun? And he kind of looked at me for a second in that way that you were describing, kind of looked up and had a moment of a think. He said, yeah, it was really interesting. I learned a great deal. And he said, but one thing that struck me was I never saw anybody reading at your research center. And this was something that has stuck with me since he said it, was, we spend a lot of time processing, talking interdisciplinarily, doing whatever, and writing stuff up and writing books and doing research and so forth. But are we stopping and doing enough reading? And of course, one thing was, it was generational, right? I'm reading all the time. It just might be a PDF on my laptop that he sees me looking into my laptop, or it might be, processing lots of little bits of information in various ways. I am constantly reading, but are we reading in the same way? Are we contemplating in the same way? Do we have the open spaces to think as much? And that I'm still wondering about that. Do we read enough? The other just sort of similar anecdote, more than anything. The Harvard Law School Library, which I now am director of, has this unbelievably big, huge reading room. It's just a beautiful old space, and it's got lots of books and so forth. And it's packed. It's absolutely packed with students. I've never seen them, doing this, taking something off the shelf and reading it. But they're there. They're there, and they're studying in these spaces. And I sort of wonder why. Like, why do they come to the library? The connection is no faster. It's not like the internet is better in there. But there's something about the physical space and contemplation that is an intellectual hub, right? They're there using the technology in very similar ways, but it's somehow about creating an architecture where kids actually think. And lastly, many of our classes have laptops down. In fact, we have contexts in which teachers are just wonderful Socratic teachers of contract law, and it's much better that we do it this way, that we shut off the computer for that period of time. And I think one of the challenges back from the research is, how do you figure out what is downtime, downtime away from the technology in contemplation? When do you kick the kids outside and just make them play ball, right, or whatever else, ride a bike, or put the laptop down? So I think your question's a great one.
The other, that it will just use the technology area with a lot more energy and a lot more thoughtfulness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I think that's exactly right.
How's technology widened the generational gap? So, I mean, parents didn't have the same experience their kids did. They're not nearly as connected, and so they probably can't sit in their kid's chair and really understand. And so, how has that created any additional distance in the generational gap?
So I think the distance is created mostly, to be honest, by the parents. It's created by the parents and the teachers who come at an experience and say, this is so weird. Like, what you're doing is so weird and remote. I suspect it's not true of most Microsoft employees with their kids. I'm not worried about you at all. I am worried somewhat about teachers who have been teaching for decades and decades in schools, wonderful, devoted teachers, but when they see kids learning in this way, they just say, you're dumber, right? And say, I don't have a way into that conversation. I do want to pivot to the safety conversation in a moment, because I think this is one of the places where the generation gap plays out, where there's a lot that parents and teachers could be imparting to kids if they just start the conversation, if you just get into the mix to some extent. So I don't blame the technology so much. I just think that a lot of times parents check themselves out, and teachers do.
So to bridge the gap, it's more important to educate the parents than the kids.
We wrote this book for parents and teachers. I mean, absolutely. My friend and I, as we were trying to figure out what to write, we were sitting in a bar having a beer and saying, like, so what book are we going to write? And he looked at me and he said, we have to have the courage to write a book for parents and teachers. Forget about the academics, forget about the technologists. That's the audience ultimately. That's my theory, but could be wrong. So.
Actually, my mother was a teacher for years. She told me World of Warcraft was destroying my daughter.
Was it?
No.
Good.
I said to her, my daughter was 10 or 11 at the time, and I said, ask her about the auction house and how to capitalize on the various warp and weft of money per week and per day and per item. And half an hour later, she walked away and said, God, that kid knows her stuff.
Pretty interesting, right?
Now, she was a teacher for years, and she did, in my own household, my mother, the teacher, doesn't understand what my 11-year-old is picking up on her own. I didn't teach her how to manipulate the auction house and rip everybody off. She figured it out herself.
Fabulous. That's great.
But if you had, say, you had a presidential campaign level of funding to solve this problem, where would you start? Or do you even think that's necessary? Will it just fix itself?
Well, what's the it that we want to fix?
the complete misunderstanding between, say, teachers and the kids that they teach?
So I think, as with anything, in a time of transition, you need experiments, right? You need lots of different things that are working to see what pops. I think that's why a research center like this is perfect. I'm dying to know how this game works out with blowing kids up, blowing things up. That will be very interesting to see if that's a good one or a bad one, and the copyright curriculum and so forth. One thing I really want to do, but haven't got the money or the time to do, is something called the Youth Technology Core. And the idea basically is, whenever we've gone in with young people to schools and parent-teacher groups or places where you have teachers and students to talk about safety or any of these very specific issues, when you have dynamic young people who describe it and will show off a Facebook profile, will show how you get some music onto your Zune or whatever it is unbelievable how quickly just light bulbs start going off and conversations start. It seems to me so dead simple that what we need to do is, crack into the conversation. Now, I realize there are a zillion demands on people's times, right? There's too much in curricula already. Parents and teachers have too much to worry about. But I actually think this is a really important thing for our economy, for the safety of our kids, and so forth. So I would love to see the Youth Technology Core, which is, a bunch of kids who are 16 to 21 or whatever, who spend their summers or, part of their kind of an internship going around to lots of different schools and just like forcing this conversation to some extent and say, let me show you World of Warcraft. Let's go through it and let's have a conversation about what's happening. Because I think that conversation in that context for what's going on, you're absolutely going to get really interesting, common sense. You're going to get absolutely interesting pushback from kids and so forth. So that would be my like, fund it Barack, please, or fund it McCain, please, kind of project. So, Mr. Khan.
I'm interested to know whether you have a sense, or anybody in the room has a sense of how long the generation gap is likely to persist. I mean, there are lots of people having, children who are 25 or 30 and aren't that removed from Facebook or probably are on Facebook. I mean, is there a natural point at which it kind of goes away a little bit, or are those people suddenly so busy in their jobs that they lose a little touch with?
I have no clue. Does anybody else have a thought on this? Yeah.
I was a high school computer science teacher for a while, a few years back, and for the generation gap, I don't think there'll be a problem in 20 years because the older teachers are retiring, the younger, recent college grad teachers are all coming in and they Facebook their students and everything, and so I don't think that'll be a large problem. And the other thing I was thinking, bring back your comment on Wikipedia. I think the problem lies with the teachers, right? It's an online encyclopedia. We don't teach kids how to do these things, like how to edit things on Wikipedia. It's not the most, intuitive thing to go into Wikipedia and edit things and know how the whole process goes. To a kid, it's like you go into a library and scribbling on an encyclopedia. That's librarian would not be happy, right? So I think one part is including technology relevant curriculum in schools as a part of history and stuff. Like a teacher could be showing this is how you search Wikipedia, but if you edit it and stuff. So I don't think we have curriculum right now that includes all these things that enables kids to be creative and add to it.
And I'm worried that a lot of the time in the schools that I saw, computer class is like a separate class. It's like you go over there to the computer lab as opposed to thinking, no, this is just life. It's just research. It should be in any class where it's relevant and not in those classes where it's not, right? It seems to me that it's a modular thing. It's just a matter of sort of thinking what is the digital media skill that we need kind of in this environment. So,
I think that until more of this law gets revoked, the generation gap is going to get wider as time goes on.
Could be.
We haven't even seen anything yet.
It's amazing to reflect on the speed of change that you guys in part are responsible for, right? I mean, if you think about with the printing press, it goes from, hundreds of years between the invention of the printing press and Gutenberg's first Bible. You think about it's a matter of years, decades, right, for this just extraordinary change that's happening. We have no idea where we're going to be 10 years from now. It's sort of amazing.
On that note, have you asked these kids where they think this is going? Like, what is the second generation going to look like?
We didn't. It was not part of our questions. It was not, although that would be interesting. I think it's going in part where technology companies like yours nudge it. I think it's in part where your customers nudge you. I think it's an iterative process that I think it has a lot, obviously, to do with the social web and technologies that are being developed to propel us forward in that particular way. But I'm no prognosticator. This was really meant to be an empirical thing to describe how it is and to see what the problems are coming from it. I want to take a few of the ones just up here for a moment. So the question on the left, you've refuted 4 myths in your book, and that's very affirming. Do you, from the work, have an idea of the social impact that the tools and impairment you hint at will have? So I think this is, in a way, the thesis of the book is about the fact that we face a choice. I think we genuinely, as parents and teachers and technologists, less extent lawyers, that we face a choice as to whether or not we want to embrace the technologies and the way young people are using it, or do we resist it, right? That in lots of respects, if we can figure out how do we embrace creativity, innovation, civic activism using these little seeds that I thought were maybe going to be, great oaks already, which aren't, are we going to embrace those? I think there's a very bright future. I'm quite worried, though, about overreaction to some of the negative things. And so I think this might be a useful pivot, and I'm probably going to put Jules on the spot, if he doesn't mind, about safety, which is I'm extremely interested in this question of keeping kids safe online. So even though it's, I had it in the category of myth that kids are more in danger, it's clear they're in danger, right? It is clear that there are, just as any young people growing up, there are bad things that can happen to them. And as a parent of 2 kids, I don't want bad things to happen to my kids. So, it's not that there's not a problem there, it's just not that it's wildly different or much greater than it's been in the past. So one of the questions we've been trying to take up, and I'd love to hear thoughts of this crew, is, what is technology's role in that? Obviously, education's super important. Obviously, there's much that parents and teachers can do, but what can Microsoft do? What can your industry do, really, as part of this? And Jules has been working on at least an answer to this, which we're taking up in public in a few days on September 23rd. So I was hoping you might give us a little preview to the brainstorm you guys have had and what you're thinking.
So one of the framework in which we think about kid safety at Microsoft generally is around the tools to empower parents, educational resources to empower parents and teachers and educators.
Hey Jules, do you want to come to the mic just in case I don't know if it's better for people remotely?
Yeah.
If they're on the mic. It's too interesting to miss. So. Oh yeah, sorry.
Jules Cohen, I work in TWC. Trustworthy Computing.
Oh yeah. Good.
Trustworthy Computing. The W is really small.
It is worthy, but it's not like capital worthy.
Yeah, I can't. The joke's not flowing. Anyway, the way we think of safety at TWC basically falls into 3 buckets. We think of it in terms of tools to empower parents. We don't think of ourselves as playing the role of parents at all. We provide some tools. We provide educational resources to help parents and caregivers and educators use those tools and teach kids and themselves how to be safer online. And then we provide a variety of resources to law enforcement and governments. But one of the thing I think John's talking about in particular is one of the questions that came up sort of as a result of the rather loud media discussion around predation was, are there ways to create significantly safer spaces for kids online? And safer in this context is used kind of it's more the safer from bad adults piece as opposed to safer from each other. Obviously, the cyberbullying conversation will persist sort of regardless of where you are, and that's a function of putting the right tools inside the products and the right moderation processes in place, and the right ways to call for help. But there's this question around how do you keep kids safe from adults who may cause them harm, and obviously you can't really keep kids safe who are looking to circumvent a process that you put in place. It's hard in the world to keep people safe from themselves, kids or adults, any way you cut it. But there's a class of people who we think we'd like to keep safe, to help keep safe, and it's a class of people who wants to be safe. So the question is there a way to create safer digital playgrounds for kids who themselves want to be safe and have parental relationships where the parents are trying to find places for them to be safe? And there's this notion of, is there a way to create sort of digital playground walled environments where those kids can exist, but it's hard to get in if you're an adult. And in the press, we've read, and folks in regulatory positions and others have called for age verification. Is there a way we can verify the age of everybody on the internet and use that as some way to separate the populations? And it's pretty hard to do. It's pretty hard to separate people based on any attribute, and this is one that rises to a level where you need some pretty concrete evidence to. I mean, age verification is really identity verification. You can't know how old somebody is without really knowing who they are, and it's pretty hard to know that I'm the one standing behind this laptop right now as opposed to John, who you might guess would be standing here. And there are ways to do it for adults. In the U.S., it's not super hard to verify an adult with a fairly high degree of accuracy if you're in a credit database. A private company can look at your credit report, generate a bunch of multiple choice questions based on it, ask them to you, and if you answer them correctly, it's unlikely that somebody else would know that I have a loan from X bank, which may or may not be in business today.
You get to answer that first question on the left there now, Jules, since you brought up banking. But
I can't read and talk at the same time.
You don't have to.
Anyway,
that's a joke.
So anyway, hopefully the bank is still in business. But with a fairly high degree of accuracy, you can prove that an adult with a credit history is who they say they are. But kids aren't in those databases, and for good reason. Like the digital dossier for a child, as we learned about in the video, doesn't extend that far yet, and certainly shouldn't. There are, however, some sort of times in society where offline we've sanctioned moments in time where people can look at documents and say, oh, this is who it says it is. This is a child, and we have a ceremony that exists in MeetSpace. And there you can think of what they are. Oh, getting a driver's license. There's a ceremony. You go to the DMV, you hand over your documents, and maybe they hand you a card back if you can back up into the parking spot correctly. Or registering for school. You show up, a parent shows up, a child shows up, birth certificate, and whatever other documentation is necessary, maybe a utility bill or whatever they're looking for proof of residency. And there's somebody who's trained to say, how old is this child, and look at the documentation and actually make a judgment. And there's an in-person proofing moment. And it's really hard to have those kinds of in-person proofing moments online. You can generate a fair degree of trust through various things like the credit history thing, or on eBay a fairly high degree of trust through reputation systems. But they all sort of they don't get you there. So in order to really generate the amount of trust that we think is necessary to create a credential that's a concrete credential for a child that they could use in sort of an online space to prove their age, we think you have to look to reusing trust that exists offline. And if you could create a world where people who are in positions to issue and create that trust offline can also issue it in the form of a digital credential, then perhaps children can in turn use those digital credentials to auth into more secure digital playgrounds of the type that we're talking about. All sorts of, should they do that? Is it a good thing for society? Is it the right thing for privacy reasons? How about resourcing indemnity? There's lots of problems in this arena, but conceptually, a hardened credential that a child could use to auth into a digital space that probably doesn't include any PII is sort of one way we think about solving that problem. We'll probably stop there.
No, that's awesome. I would love. Do you mind staying up here? Because I think I would love to hear what. So we're about to hear from Microsoft and 16 other companies about ideas like this on September 23rd in front of the bunch of attorneys general and the public and so forth. So you're hearing the idea that your company is about to put forward about kids and safety. And I'd love to hear, sort of initial reacts. Is that unfair?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was probably the shortest version of that spiel
that I've given. No, of course. It's an unbelievably complex topic, and it's this nicely kind of distilled down. So I'd be really grateful for reactions, whether this is a good way to go or less so.
I have a question. So have kids given feedback on some of these spaces? Because in some sense, in order for it to work,
let me give you a. You can keep going, actually.
I was just going to say, in order for it to work, it'd be interesting to know sort of how that breaks down at different ages as well.
Let me give you two answers. So that we just separate the user experience from the auth. And I'm mostly talking about the auth. From a user experience perspective, I hope that some really enterprising company or Microsoft or somebody else comes up with a user experience that's worth the time to use such a robust auth to get into. We haven't asked kids for feedback on the auth, and I'm not the user experience expert. So not specifically, but in particular, we're talking about the authentication process as opposed to what you get into.
So the point is, one could imagine a space that Lily and company would design and test, and it would be completely wonderful, and the kind of plumbing that you're creating would be something in the background that would kind of make it more likely to be a safe experience. You're not talking about the fun so much, you're talking about the
Correct.
safe, if that makes sense. So it could be a collaboration here between MSR and the
Indeed.
T small WC crew, right?
Small WC.
Tying back into the earlier Your question of whether this generation gap is likely to disappear as you have over 20 years. I wonder if all the privacy issues are likely to disappear or certainly be less front and center than they are now. And maybe some of your research ties into this. I've heard anecdotally that there's a huge generation gap as far as expectations of privacy. And I've talked to my own kids, and be like, they know who you are on that site. Duh. Of course. And they seem to have a much lower expectation that they have privacy.
So I wear a privacy hat in the other half of my life. And I've read a number of articles about sort of the generation gap on privacy. I think that you have an old artificial line around PII. And in the old world, you had this sort of regime where if something was personally identifiable, and that meant it was attached to your name, your address, your social security number, anything that could, your email address, anything that could get me back to you in particular, there's harm, there's risk there. But if you have sort of an amorphous data set that isn't attached to one of these elements of PII, there's no risk. That's blurred, and it's not necessarily even parties as sort of slow moving, if you will, as the FTC have kind of said, I'm not sure that there's really a distinction there anymore. And I think that it's one of those things where the older generation is very leery of things that connect it to themselves, and I wonder if it's maybe they have assets they're trying to protect and the kids don't, or maybe there's any number of sort of answers to it. From my perspective, you kind of put in what you get out. And if you put in something and you identify yourself and you have a discussion in one of these contexts, you're more likely to get something out of value at the other end. Whereas if you remain anonymous, there's some anonymous ones up there, you may or may not get more back. It's hard. I don't know the answer to it for you.
So with the committee, are there certain things that you're hoping the government doesn't do, recommendations that they shouldn't do, or areas where or things that you're hoping they would do?
This is a hard, tricky question. As the chairman of the task force, no.
I have an answer.
No, I'd like to hear it.
Well, from my perspective, the kind of thing that I just described, I would prefer, I strongly prefer that would be the kind of thing that parents would ask for and the market would generate. And as a result, it would exist. And I would strongly urge folks not to think about regulating a scenario like that, where in order to get online, you had to be somehow, in possession of a hard credential. Would
you want legislation in the form, if you've done that identification, it's a safe harbor, you can do certain things that you wouldn't otherwise. That enables the market as opposed to disabling the market.
I'd have to think that one through. Generally, legislation that catalyzes markets to do these kinds of things is something we would consider, but in the specifics, I don't know the answer, and I would probably defer to Chuck behind you.
Regulation is a two-edged sword.
Totally.
At Microsoft, we tend our automatic response is don't regulate.
On this particular point, I'm totally with you, and I'm cognizant of the goods and the bads there. On this particular point, we don't want all kids to be required to use.
That kind of regulation, that's right. But
and he may have a different set of answers to this one.
No, I would say it's too early in our task force process to answer the question. Basically, I think this process has been in the shadow of regulation, to be honest. It is the attorneys general did not have, I guess, the case to regulate directly in this instance, or they didn't feel like they could use those regulatory hooks. What they did was they came to a voluntary agreement with these companies, and you guys have joined the crew as good citizens. I can't imagine, I suppose there's business interest there too, but there's some extent to which it's industry coming together to care about our kids, right? They've asked us to evaluate a series of technologies and come back to them and say, okay, what's the state of technology? And I think the idea is, can industry step up and self-regulate? It's very similar to what Chuck Costin's working on with Colin McClay and others on the principles of free expression and privacy. It's happening in the shadow of the Global Online Freedom Act. In that case, is the Congress going to legislate when you go to China you can't turn over certain information in this situation? Or, before that happens, can industry actually get it together, right, and figure it out? So I'm, at least in this case, of the mind, said, let's figure it out. Let's see if there is a role, and can we, if we're parents, teachers, coaches, mentors, technology companies, and so forth, make it safer for kids such that you don't need some heavy-handed form of legislation. I totally agree, though, that we should be open to what regulation means in this space. It could be technology regulation. This is the Lessig concept that, code is law. But I also think there are at least three things a law can do, right? It can restrict, it can create a level playing field in the case of competition, or it can enable, right? It can be an incentive of some sort. So I'm not against the notion of regulating, but I think what we're trying to do is an iterative process. Are there brilliant people? Are there the Jules Cohns in the world who are going to come up with the answer within these companies, get industry buy-in, maybe do a little development, maybe do a little testing in some labs and so forth, and solve the problem without having to do classic, traditional, top-down, here's the law regulation. So I think that's sort of where we are in the process. Chuck?
I mean, one small intervention from the lawyer who's been helping Jules with this.
Not the lawyer.
I think the way Jules described it is exactly right, in the sense that from Microsoft's perspective, we're not allergic to regulation per se, but that there are gradations in the types of activities that government can undertake. Government can be a bully pulpit for education. Government
or a bully
can be a bully to encourage companies, as it kind of did in this particular case. And then I think this is in the book as well. There's a role for legislation as part of the blended approach and targeted on a case-by-case basis. So there may be certain things that have to happen in order to catalyze the market. There may be certain things that have to happen in order for providers to enter the market and feel that, hey, this is worth doing it, and I won't face liability if I exercise due care when I go forward with this. And I think in a sense we're less interested in the what should government do, because we have to think through that and work through the practical kind of questions, as we are in the what types of facts are informing government's opinion about what it should do. Are they reacting to news reports, popular hysteria, moral panics, or are they responding to the facts about technology and the privacy and security trade-offs that are involved in various approaches and so forth? So I think that's really where we have the most addressable gap as a general matter, is what sort of facts inform the government thinking process.
Absolutely. Yeah, sorry. Cool. So Jules, thank you for that. That's so fun. You're so nice to do it.
Pleasure.
I just wanted to answer, if this video will come back up for 1 sec, sort of by way of conclusion, in a sense. Two questions that are up here at the top. Are Vic and Salil, are you in the room or remote? In the room, good. Maybe one and one. Anyway, hi to the remotes. So it seems like these are tightly related questions, and somebody has made the nice kind of connection between the two. There's a chapter in the book to which I can refer you fairly far along, in which we look at the role of young people in really three ways in the business world. It's called Innovators, Chapter 10. And we think about young people from the perspective of employees, from the perspective of consumers, and as entrepreneurs or innovators in these spaces. And one of the examples that we use on the consumer side, and I can't remember if it actually made it into the written text of the book, but I'll verify later. I think what you guys did with IE7, when you released a beta version of that out into the world and then encouraged criticism to come to your doorstep, knowing that there was going to be a feedback loop from your consumers, your young consumers, is exactly the right thing to do, which is to say, we know that many of these young people are going to be critical consumers, and they're going to sound off. They're going to say, your burritos stink, right? Or whatever the thing is, and they're going to say it in public. And I think to the extent that you can construct an environment, bring them to your door, and actually make it constructive so that you're giving some feedback that then makes the product better for them, I think that's a wonderful example of kind of doing it the right way. And I think you can extrapolate that, also to, employees, that clearly there's a sense among the kids we talk to going into the workplace that hierarchy, is being broken down a little bit, and there are good and bad to that. I think in that case, there are things where we do need to be teaching young people that, there are certain times when you do respect people who are in authority, but also to say, okay, what is interesting about these broken down hierarchies? What are the innovative things that you're doing that in fact can make our business run better? So, I think we're going to see a transition that's going to happen incredibly quickly as firms are seeing their brands subjected to this very public, whether it's a bank or a technology company, this very public scrutiny, and those that manage that conversation well are going to thrive. And I think the same thing is true of companies as employers, those who realize these are the young people you're going to be hiring, and a very large percentage of them act in these weird ways. How do you figure out to create, a constructive environment for them? And I think, just as a kind of a meta and ending point to that, I feel like where we are at this moment with this population is to say they're looking on one level for leadership, right? They're looking for these constructive environments and, good leadership and parenting and teaching, all of these things. This is available to us. And at the same time, I think there's a ton that we can learn from them. I think we can be blown away by their creativity, blown away by their innovation, blown away by the extent to which they can teach us about these technologies, and we have to be open to and engaging that conversation and creating the spaces for it, and occasionally telling them laptops down, go outside, it's beautiful, and have a nice day. So thank you for the chance to talk to us here.
Thanks, everybody. I think we have some information about the center, don't we?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, please. Yep.
You can obviously find them on the web, clearly. I also want to say we have a few people coming to speak this fall and winter on these same topics. Larry Lessig will be here on November 12th, talking about his new book, Remix. And then in terms of education and computing, Jane Margolis is going to be in early December talking about her book called Stuck in the Shallow End, Race, Technology, and Computing, and how to bridge that gap. So you can go find the whole list on our SharePoint site. And if you guys don't have that address, just email the SpeakRec alias and we'll get you to the SharePoint. But thanks, everybody. And John will be here signing books for people that have the physical manifestation of the work. And thanks, John, for coming. Sure. We brought some Sharpies up here for people to come up here.